Tom Cameron's way.
Chad Huntley. David Benson. John Brokaw.
President Bush meets with his national security team and insists they're making good progress, hammering out a new strategy for Iraq. The last word. President Gerald Ford opposed the war. Why did he keep it a secret until after his death? Tone deaf. How a message service that's supposed to help the hearing impaired is being used by criminals, and you're paying for it. And thank you for not smoking in, of all places, the Capitol. The era of the cigar-chomping politician is officially over.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams. Substituting tonight, Campbell Brown.
Good evening. There is late word tonight that the execution of Saddam Hussein may be imminent. The former Iraqi dictator lost his appeal earlier this week. He has been in the custody of U.S. forces. NBC's Richard Engel is standing by live in Baghdad with the very latest. Richard, what do we know?
Good evening, Campbell. NBC News has learned that the U.S. military has received a formal request from the Iraqi government to transfer Saddam Hussein to Iraqi authority. That would be one of the last steps required before Saddam Hussein's actual execution. NBC News has also been told by U.S. military and intelligence officials that the execution could take place within the next 48 hours or perhaps as early as tomorrow. Saddam Hussein was apparently preparing for that moment. A lawyer said that he was receiving today two of his half-brothers who are also held at a U.S. military detention facility here in Baghdad. The U.S. military says it will be on a state of high alert throughout the execution period. Campbell?
All right, Richard, thank you. Richard Engel for us from Baghdad tonight. President Bush met with his war cabinet today to finalize a new strategy for Iraq, and he also faced new criticism of his handling of the war from a surprising voice, former President Gerald Ford. We have a report tonight on comments Ford made 2 years ago. But first to Crawford, Texas, where President Bush says he is making progress on a new war plan. NBC's Campbell ODonnell has more on that. Kelly, good evening.
Good evening, Campbell. Unprepared to say how or what he will do differently on Iraq just yet, the president today relied on some hard-to-define phrases, saying he's making good progress and coming close to closure on a revamped strategy. Call to Crawford, Texas, the president's most senior and influential wartime advisors, including his new defense secretary, just 10 days on the job. After a 3-hour meeting, the president said he wants more consultation.
We're making good progress toward coming up with a plan that we think will help us achieve our objective.
Intending this to be more than a high-profile photo op, advisors are trying to thread a needle, saying no decisions have been made, but still claiming a plan is taking shape. The president described the enemy as extremists and radicals, but made no mention today of al-Qaeda, and appeared to push more burden on the Iraqi government.
Key to success in Iraq is to have a government that's willing to deal with the elements there that are trying to prevent this young democracy from succeeding.
Advisors describe a 3-part plan, saying considerable weight involves security, then economic and political steps. The option of sending more troops is still in play. One administration official today talked about the complexity of moving personnel, while some outside military experts remain unconvinced a potential surge would work.
The big question is whether it's 5,000, 15,000, or 30,000 troops, do we believe that will change the nature of the civil war in Baghdad? I think the reasonable answer is no, it won't.
The president offered his concern for the troops in the form of a New Year resolution.
My resolution is that they'll be safe and that we'll come closer to our objective.
The White House said today that although the body of President Ford will lie in state beginning Saturday at the U.S. Capitol, President Bush will not leave Crawford, Texas until Monday, and then he'll go directly to the Capitol to pay his respects. Campbell?
Kelly O'Donnell in Crawford, Texas. Kelly, thank you. Now to President Ford's view of the war, which came to light just a day after his death. The former president talked about the war with Bob Woodward of the Washington Post. Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell spoke to Woodward about it today.
Gerald Ford, loyal to the end to his closest former aides, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, was privately torn about their most controversial policy, the Iraq War. Only weeks before Ford's last visit to Washington in 2004, he told author Bob Woodward he strongly disagreed with the decision to invade Iraq. Woodward taped the interview with the former president's knowledge.
I think Rumsfeld, Cheney, and the president made a big mistake in justifying going into the war in Iraq. They put the emphasis on weapons of mass destruction.
The former president didn't know George W. Bush very well and is not known to have offered him advice on Iraq. But he told Woodward,
and I just don't think we should go hellfire damnation around the globe freeing people unless it is directly related to our own national security.
Today, Woodward told NBC News that Ford was emphatic and knew the interview would be used after his death.
He wouldn't have done it. It was not a necessary war in his view, and he criticized the justifications that Bush and his team gave for launching the war.
In criticizing these decisions, he was criticizing two people who were his protégés.
That's right. He said that Cheney, great chief of staff when he had worked for Ford in the White House in the 70s, but said he had turned pugnacious, was the word he used.
Pugnacious?
Pugnacious, a fighter.
Ford also told Woodward he would have relied longer on economic sanctions against Saddam Hussein and UN inspections, and that ultimately it was the president, not his aides, who made the decision to invade. Former aides say Ford's views were heavily influenced by the war he inherited, Vietnam, and lifelong regret that America had stayed too long and was finally forced to retreat on his watch. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
NBC News will provide live coverage of the state funeral for former President Ford at the Capitol Saturday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and of the funeral services at the National Cathedral in Washington Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern. Brian Williams will anchor here on this NBC station. More on Iraq today, where we learned of the deaths of 4 more Americans. As the death toll edges closer to 3,000, NBC's Jim Maceda takes a look at the challenges for U.S. troops on the front lines in Baghdad.
On every street corner, behind every door of every house.
Back here at home, a New Orleans grand jury has indicted 4 police officers on charges of first-degree murder and 3 others on charges of attempted murder in what has become known as the Danziger Bridge incident. The case stems from the shooting of 2 men during the chaotic aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The men were killed in what police say was a gun battle, with officers claiming they were fired upon and appropriately returning fire. But witnesses dispute that account. No guns were found on the victims, and the coroner's report shows that 1 man was shot 5 times in the back. Before those indictments were announced, there was political news being made in New Orleans. Former North Carolina Senator John Edwards announced he is running for president. Edwards was Senator John Kerry's running mate 2 years ago, and as NBC's Chip Reed tells us tonight, he is sticking with the message he brought to that campaign this time around as well.
John Edwards says he chose New Orleans to announce his candidacy because of the deep poverty revealed by Hurricane Katrina, still raw 16 months later.
New Orleans in so many ways shows the 2 Americas that I have talked about in the past.
If that sounds familiar, 2 Americas, one rich, one poor, it's the same theme he ran on in 2004 and lost. The question now?
What is the difference this time around?
Well, you learn a lot from going through a national campaign, and I certainly learned a lot.
He insists that includes listening to his heart instead of political consultants, avoiding the media filter by putting his message on the website YouTube, and what he calls dreaming big dreams like universal health care and bringing 40,000 to 50,000 troops home from Iraq immediately.
We need to make it clear that we intend to leave Iraq and turn over the responsibility of Iraq to the Iraqi people. The best way to make that clear is to actually start leaving.
Like this location, the timing of Edwards' announcement was also carefully calculated. His campaign had hoped that this week between Christmas and New Year's would be a slow period for news, allowing him to steal the spotlight, at least temporarily, from Democrats Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who've been dominating the political headlines, forcing Edwards to announce earlier than he'd planned.
Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton sucking up so much oxygen in this race, there's probably room for one more. There's probably 3 tickets out of Iowa. The question is it John Edwards?
After leaving New Orleans today, Iowa was Edwards' first stop. He says he'll spend as much time there as it takes to win, a strategy some political analysts say is his only hope in a crowded Democratic field. Chip Reed, NBC News, New Orleans.
On Wall Street today, stocks were down slightly. The Dow lost 9 points on the day. The Nasdaq was down more than 5 points. When Nightly News continues on this Thursday evening, NBC News In Depth. How a phone service that's supposed to help the hearing impaired has been hijacked by crooks. And later, it's time for politicians and lobbyists to take a deep breath. Washington's smoke-filled rooms are about to be banned.
NBC.
NBC News In Depth tonight, phone fraud. It has to do with that portion of your bill called disability access or carrier cost recovery fee. Part of that fee funds a service making it easier for the deaf and hard of hearing to communicate with others. But an NBC News investigation found it may actually be helping criminals most of all. Here's NBC's senior investigative correspondent Lisa Myers with our exclusive report In Depth. For Steve, when Nightly News continues in a moment, another big winter storm in the West. Will this become another traveler's nightmare? In New York's Harlem neighborhood tonight, a huge crowd and a celebratory air outside the famed Apollo Theater, where thousands are standing in line for a chance to pay last respects to James Brown. Brown, who died Christmas Day at age 73, is lying in repose on the Apollo stage, scene of his musical debut in 1956. Earlier in the day, fans lined the streets as his body was taken to the theater in a horse-drawn carriage. Now a follow-up to a story we brought you earlier this week. The FDA made it official today, ruling that meat and milk from cloned animals is safe to eat. Government scientists say there is no difference between food from clones and food from conventional livestock. It could still be years before cloned food shows up on store shelves. To Denver now, where New Year's travelers packed the airport today trying to get out of town ahead of another winter storm that is threatening to make a mess of holiday travel yet again. NBC's Leanne Gregg joins me now from Denver. Leanne, good evening.
Good evening, Campbell. There's concern about major travel disruptions in Denver and beyond because by tomorrow, more than a foot of new snow is expected here in Denver on top of the 2 feet from last week's blizzard. Colorado's governor has declared a statewide disaster emergency for the second time in a week. Travelers at Denver International Airport again are facing long lines, cancellations, and delays. Thousands of people at the airport are scrambling to try and get out ahead of the storm. 2 of the major airlines serving Denver, United and Frontier, have already canceled more than 200 flights. More cancellations are expected. Last week, you may remember 5,000 people were stranded at the airport while it was shut down for 2 days. Travel on the roads also, that's causing problems. Interstate 70 that leads in and out of the mountains, one of the main corridors to the west, was shut down for several hours today. Blizzard conditions are expected again tomorrow on the eastern plains, and we could see even more road closures. Campbell?
All right, Leanne Gregg in snowy Denver tonight. Leanne, thanks. And I'll be right back with the end of a Washington institution, the smoke-filled room. As 2006 draws to an end, so does an era in Washington, the era of the proverbial smoke-filled room. For more than a century, cigar smoking has been part of the fabric of American politics. And as some will mourn yet another tradition lost, plenty of others are glad to see it go. Here's NBC's Pete Williams.
After spending the day wielding influence or hoping to, Washington.
And that is our broadcast for this Thursday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Campbell Brown. We'll look for you right back here tomorrow night. Have a good night, everybody.
tonight.
Good morning. Any moment, Saddam Hussein set to be hanged as early as today. But will his execution